Welcome to the ETHICOMP, the Future of Value-Sensitive Design panel. Wherever you are, whatever time of the day it is, welcome, and we're glad to have you here. In this panel, we're going to be discussing the future of value-sensitive design, and we might consider the short-term future over the next 5 years, and the long-term future over the next 10 to 20 years. We have a set of panelists here that have been thinking about the future of value-sensitive design over the last decade or so. And we have junior scholars as well as senior scholars. Our format for the panel is that there'll be about 10 minutes of introductory remarks from each of the panelists. And then we'll turn to a question and answer and conversation. And I will try to moderate that. My name is David Hendry from the University of Washington Information School, and it's my pleasure to be the moderator. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass the baton over to our first panelist.
Hi, everyone. I'm Stephen Umbrello, Managing Director at the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, as well as a researcher at the University of Turin in North Italy. I guess to kick off the discussion period, in 2019, Ryers and Gordon published a paper proposing an alternative to value-sensitive design that they called virtuous practice design. And it was predicated on a long-standing critique of value-sensitive design, and that is, what is value-sensitive design's moral commitments, or what is the foundational moral theories or theory that value-sensitive design builds itself from and moves forward with in any given design program. So I think one of the fundamental questions that we should ask is there a more preferable moral theory or moral theories that make itself suitable to the value-sensitive design approach? And maybe more presciently, should there be a single moral theory or a group of theories in moral psychology or philosophy that should be adopted into the value-sensitive design approach? Similarly, what is value-sensitive design's position within democratic regimes, as well as how does value-sensitive design, if at all, co-construct democratic values?
Thank you, Stephen. On to our second panelist.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm Daisy Yu. I'm a postdoc at the Aarhus University in Denmark. I've been practicing value-sensitive design for almost 10 years now. My background is in human-computer interaction design, and I have the privilege to work with and learn from Batya, Friedman, and Dave Hendry, who are my PhD advisors. My research broadly focuses on designing socio-technical systems for and with public sector organizations. For example, I've been working with international criminal tribunals, public transportation agencies, and most recently with public libraries. Designing for publics raises many interesting questions for value-sensitive design. There are questions of participation and inclusion. How do you engage with very diverse and complex networks of stakeholders such as publics? Each stakeholder has different interests, needs, and values. So how do you navigate value tensions? Another important question concerns time and temporality. Technologies are evolving at a very rapid pace, while public organizations and policies are moving much slower. So how do you balance these very different rhythms between technology and public sectors? And rapidly or slowly, the world is constantly changing, and so are the values. So how can we trace and deal with changing values over time? These are just some examples of questions that I bring to the table, and I'm very excited to discuss various aspects of value-sensitive design with wonderful panelists today. Thank you.
Thank you, Daisy.
Hi, I'm Batya Friedman. I'm also from the Information School at the University of Washington. And along with Dave, I co-direct the Value Sensitive Design Lab there. We've been a lab for nearly 20 years. And I also co-direct a tech policy lab as well. So when I'm thinking about value sensitive design right now and thinking about where are the places where I think we need to really make some good progress in the next handful of years, handful being 5 to 10 to 20. One thing I think is that if value-sensitive design is really going to have an impact, there needs to be uptake. And so while I think we have learned a lot and we know a lot more about doing this kind of design work than we did, say, 10 or 20 years ago, its infusion into industry practice and also into education at the university level, undergraduate and graduate, but also even in middle schools, is something that I think needs to happen. And then when we talk about uptake in what way and in what level, and I think there's a lesson from participatory design here, where we've seen a lot of the methods from PD absorbed, but without some of the theoretical framings behind it. And so I think it's important that the theoretical constructs of value-sensitive design go forward as well. So these commitments to diverse stakeholders, indirect stakeholders, engaging with value tensions are really important things. And then my last thought is, I think the work we began with Lisa Nathan around 2010 on multi-lifespan design, looking at these societal problems that will take a long time to resolve and thinking about the design process there is really important. And they cause us to look longer term and also systemically. And I think that the challenges we face by and large are systemic. And so how do we continue to orient and reorient on those problems and processes, I think is another really important area. So thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here and looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Batya. And our final panelist?
Yeah, my name is Jeroen van Hoven, and I'm a professor of ethics and technology at Delft University of Technology, where I'm heading up an institute, Delft Design for Values Institute. And I've been working with Batya and Dave for quite some time, and also with some of the other panelists. This goes back, I think, some 20 years. And I think looking at the future that value-sensitive design will only become more important because it offers a very tractable and well-ordered framework to bring those two worlds of ethics and values closer to the world of engineering and high technology. And that is exactly what is needed. People are at a loss of what to do with a lot of these ethical notions that are becoming so prominent given the type of problems that we are confronted with. So I think that future is going to be bright in that sense. But I agree with Batya that uptake is of the utmost importance. And thinking about uptake and having more impact in the world, I see three things that are important that we could do. One is institutionalization. So we have to make it part of the furniture of the institutional world. So we have to look at standards like ISO. We already have made some first attempts to do that. Standards is very important, like in standard business reporting, or having a chapter in every business report or annual report of a company on the UN SDGs or diversity or climate change. So you have to speak to that and you have to deliver on that. And you have to do that in a way that is that we can check, that we can demonstrate that you're right in making sound claims. The second thing is, I think, still research. Research is still, there are a lot of open questions when it comes to one of the key technical terms that we're working with, values. So there are a lot of, it's an elusive and enigmatic concept and philosophers are all over the place. We need to shed more light on that. The social realities, the empirical research, but also the logic of it, the dynamics, the nature of value conflicts, the ontology, all of these things are still under-theorized in a sense, and we need to really get cracking on that. So it's the second thing. And the third thing is just activism. I think in order to create more impact and uptake, we have to also get our hands, and we have to, for example, do something along the lines of the people who try to draw attention to the importance of human rights, they've started to do human rights litigation. So when there is something wrong and you think you should do something about it, you should, dig in, right? And that's something along those lines. So institutionalization, further more research, and a little bit of activism.
Well, thank you very much for those introductory comments. Maybe I'll ask my first question to Stephen. Stephen, I'm wondering if you, as you look at value-sensitive design and other frameworks that engage with values, what have we learned? What are the things that we've already solved and that maybe we don't need to worry about anymore? Stephen, your machine is on mute right now. There we go.
There we go. Given what I've seen in the literature so far and some of the applied research on value-sensitive design, it seems that we've gotten pretty down-packed the social scientific or the empirical tools that we use across various domains. So obviously every technology, every design program is quite different from any other design program. And some of the critique of value-sensitive design is that whether a single design program can be overlaid with a single design approach. And I think one of the beauties of value-sensitive design is that it's extremely modular and adaptable to any given design program. And that's where I'm hesitant when I see literature that discusses the need to adhere to any singular moral theory as a foundation that VSD must commit to for any given design program. My fear is that it will be either hegemonic or overly imperial, Western, whatever it may be in design contexts that obviously have implications globally. And to that end, I think that from the methodological standpoint, that VSD is quite firm. Then when we get to the ontological foundation of value-sensitive design, the moral foundation, what values are in value-sensitive design, one of the primary critiques of value-sensitive design has always been the conflation of different kinds of values during stakeholder elicitations. Preferences in comparison to moral values and how can we distinguish them. I do think that can be a difficulty. I think that we have certain tools in the toolkit that allow us to at least distinguish that. And we do have some intuitions that allow us to distinguish between certain preferences and moral values. But I do think that it still remains an issue. And I would like to explore what kind of tools, either within moral psychology or engineering itself, that allows us to create this distinction.
Daisy, just following up on this, in terms of your work on publics and thinking about systemic issues in society, what have we learned about how to tackle those problems through the VSD lens?
VSD lens definitely helped to look into, to approach problems from a more broader stakeholder perspective, as opposed to just focusing on a small group of users. But still the question remains because when we take publics as stakeholders, there are the number of stakeholders that we have to deal with. It's very, very diverse. So it provides us language to deal with publics, the complex and multiple relationships and dynamics. And then still it opens up new questions about participation, inclusion, and how do we manage and navigate these multiple values and potential tensions.
Thanks, Daisy.
Does that make sense?
Maybe.
So during my work, I have also developed some of the new methods, such as stakeholder tokens and stakeholder mapping methods to kind of address and explore these issues, but still there are a lot of openings to explore this question.
Thank you, Daisy. Maybe this question is a back and forth that Batya and Jeroen could engage in, and that concerns the idea of activism and designer values. So if designers start to take a activist stance, how does that work as we try to check the ethical and moral stance that we're aiming for in a project?
So, Batya, do you want to
jump in, Jeroen? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that, we're at a stage now that everyone, coming back to your first question to Stephen, so what is already under our belt? What is already established? I think that everyone is now on board with respect to design is an important concept when we're talking about this space of ethics and societal considerations in technology and innovation. So design is there. But then the second, and so everyone talks about design. When you go to the European Commission's kind of policy documents, you will find a lot of talk about ethics by design. And so it started with privacy by design, and now it's responsibility by design, and so that has really landed. Then the question becomes, this is where the activism comes in, that you have to ask probing questions. Because often what you find is that these policy documents leave things at a very high level of abstraction, and then they have some additional comments on do this by design. But you don't get any answers to the question, how do you do that? How have you proceeded? And so this is, of course, where you can see whether people are very, very serious or committed about things, right? So it's sometimes I've the analogy with people who are lying, so they tend to be very abstract and not go into the details. The people who have really had these experiences will be able to give you all the details. I went out and I bumped into this and this guy. So that's a telltale. The same here, if you talk about design and it's very abstract and you're not able to show and demonstrate that you have tried to drill down to the consequences for the services or the products or the things that you were about to make, then I think that is an indication of how serious you are about that. And then coming back to your activism, well, then you have to start to be a little bit of a gadfly and say, well, if you're so committed to this, please, can we see the specs? Can we see the requirements that you ended up with after which process? Can you inform us about how you arrived at those results? So that's I think where the activism comes in.
Thank you.
Yeah, I guess part of what I wonder about is the word activism and what counts as an active activism versus anything else. To the extent that we say, for example, come to technical industry and say that there are some real limitations in the current processes that are implemented, and we're trying to bring, let's say, through trainings to those industries, through changes in standards, that then in turn hold people accountable to notions of negligence. Does that fall under the notion of activism, or is activism something else? When Jeroen was talking about some kind of litigation or some kind of public outcry, or so that's just a little bit of a question for me about, at what level, what constitutes activism? Are some of the things that we're doing that are the way of moving forward and engaging uptake, are they themselves acts of activism or not? And I just am a little bit puzzled there. But I do think changing the larger discourse is really important. And while I believe we have made progress on thinking about, you know, ethics and values and the societal implications of our technologies, and we have some more language as a public in talking about that, I still think that the really hard work of engaging in these questions in the moment of doing the technical work, we've made a small amount of progress there, but not nearly as much as I would have liked to have seen. So in fact, I think if you looked at people's technical design processes right now, when people are writing machine learning algorithms and constructing those data sets, other kinds of technical work, and you were to look back 20 years at their processes, I'm not sure that we would see yet a lot of real change there. And I think that there's a real challenge as we have more and more people engaging in the ethics around technology discourse. In a funny way, what happens is people fall back to talking to people who are like themselves. And since we have more people there, I think we are actually seeing them talk more to the people who are also doing the ethics values side of things, critical thinking sides of things, and then the technologists talking to the technologists. But I think our solutions are going to be really when we have very deep engagement of the two kinds of thinking together in the technical moment. And I think really going back to the technical moment, the technical decisions, is where that you know, important act has to happen. So maybe that's our act of activism. Maybe that's really the activist act, is when we change really how that technical decision is made. Yeah.
No, I very much agree, but it's only, I think, from my point of view, what I can see is it's only the last couple of years that we've really been able to insert this into the curriculum and to educate a new generation of engineers, software engineers, but also civil engineers and mechanical engineers. And I know that, you know, the people that are leaving Delft have been exposed in a meaningful way to a lot of this thought and have actually been doing it in their projects. So that is the first generation of professionals that are going into society, and you know, it's my experience that they are really convinced, and they won't forget that. I mean, so there may be pressure from all sides on them, and so we know that, but I think it's they have internalized it.
Yeah, and I think how we can use Delft and what Delft has done in its undergraduate professional education as a model and as a catalyst for, you know, having universities worldwide make these kinds of changes, so that, you know, this is part of that uptake, so that we really, as you say, cultivate a new way of working in the next generations of engineers going forward. Yeah. And also that we have this opportunity for it to be more than just appropriating a method, but really holding on to these theoretical constructs that I think are so important.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's a really great question for us. Like, how do we as a community help to then take this work, this leadership that Delft has done, and make it more of a kind of a real change to engineering education globally? Yeah.
Yeah. But this could only have happened, you know, on the basis of a body of knowledge that you and others have started to build, and so it has this initial credibility, and it's easier to convince people that they should do it and they should put some money into it, etc., etc. It's all part of that development, and you need to go through those phases, unfortunately. So that makes it slower, but it's happening. That's my experience.
Daisy and Stephen, would you like to weigh in on the question of institutions and activism?
Sure. So right now, I mainly actually work with engineers, mechanical engineers, particularly mechatronics or robotics. And I move around Italy in various universities, and I lecture mainly on responsible innovation and value-sensitive design. And one thing I've noticed is that none of the engineers I've ever encountered needed to be convinced about the need or role of ethics in engineering. And in fact, many of them have asked me to come speak because they've seen value in this. And I think there's pressures, institutional pressures, hopefully not ethics whitewashing pressures, but there's pressures that for what they call a human-centered approach to engineering rather than an object-centered approach. One of my difficulties that I've encountered in lecturing about value-sensitive design and so forth is that many of the engineers usually at the end are asked pretty much the same question: is now what? It's how do we actually integrate this within our day-to-day practices? Obviously, value-sensitive design is formulated in such a way as an approach that is meant to be integrated into different design programs. But I think that what's required is, like Jeroen mentioned, a standard, something that becomes part of a day-to-day practice, part of the institution itself. Because I'm seeing a difficulty in this the transition between not having a standardized approach, an approach that engineers can simply go and grab and use when they're working in their day-to-day environments, and actually doing that. So I think there needs to be a greater body of literature or greater examples on making this transition, the uptake into actually adopting a responsible innovation approach.
Yes. So my thoughts on activism would be that for me, I'm interpreting it less in political terms, like less in terms of political activism, but more in terms of design as primarily practical action. It's an act of like building things and putting things out there and engaging with real world situations. So in that sense, design in itself is intrinsically active. It's things that we do in action. And then I guess sometimes when I talk with my colleagues, other colleagues about doing value sensitive design, sometimes I feel people are like engineers and technicians. Sometimes they expect that VSD will tell you what are the values that we need to design for or build for, that kind of clear answers to what is worth designing for. But and then as all design approaches are fundamentally dealing with a lot of uncertainties, value sensitive and actually it's not really about giving you answers to what are the values that you should design for, but it is more an approach, and it gives you a lens through which you think about values, and you kind of work to find out what are the values that you should design for and how to design for those values. So I think there is a little bit of gap. But and then I think it's still important to understand that although we don't have all the answers in our hand, we should still participate in action to design things and put things out there. And then through those actions that we are actually trying to learn and explore values there. That are some of my quick thoughts on activism.
Maybe, Daisy, I can ask you a follow-up question about your work with libraries. So if we do want to change the discourse in society so that we become, as a culture, more sophisticated in the way we think about our tools and technologies and values, what role, if any, do you see libraries helping us in that goal of changing discourse?
So long time, public libraries took the role as being the gateway to knowledge in the local communities. So people come to the libraries, and the libraries provide access to the publics, what are the important knowledge and the information. And then in the initial statement, I've talked about like changing societies and changing values. So right now the technical infrastructure has changed. People now have access to information, not through the physical books and that where you have to go to the libraries, but we are accessing all the information primarily through internet and online. So there is this question about like what kind of public libraries has to play in this new changing society where they no longer are the primary gateways to knowledge and institutions. So in that sense, we are trying to understand the new values for the public libraries, and also we're taking a public participatory design approach for engaging with the situation here with public libraries. And for this, we are in this specific project, I'm taking a place-centric approach. So one of the challenge I talked about earlier with working with publics is that they are too vast, so it is very difficult to center your design work around publics as users or even stakeholders. So we are actually placing the place, physical library itself, at the center of the design, and we are approaching the concept of we call genius loci. So it's a Latin word for the spirit place. So we are trying to understand what is the character, what is the attribute and values of the place, the historical kind of values, and what should be the future values of that place. So that is some of the things that I'm currently working with.
Thanks for that. That sounds really exciting. An orientation around place. That's great. So we've talked a little bit about activism and a little bit about institutions. Are there any other thoughts that you have about these two topics before we turn to research and what kind of research problems we should be tackling over the next 5 to 10 years? So any final thoughts about institutions or activism at this point in our conversation?
Well, I just have a question maybe I would like to ask, well, Stephen and both Daisy, but in your views, what would you, if there were sort of 3 next steps that we would take around institutions and bringing value-sensitive design into these institutions in more effective ways, what would you recommend?
So I guess I can begin that one there. So I guess it depends on how we frame value-sensitive design. So I noticed a underlying critique of value-sensitive design is that the focus on the object of design, and less of a focus on practice, on the day-to-day practices. However, in your most recent book, there is a greater emphasis on practice in general. And I think that that's useful, and it's useful in the sense that it shifts the framing of value-sensitive design towards design in general, not only the design of technical objects. And what kind of power does that provide? It provides the ability to design policy also, because you can frame policy as a type of technology. And for that reason, I brought up in my last point the fact that, or my opening statement, sorry, that policy or regulation or governance in general, that is a form of innovation in and of itself. And up until this point, I think that the cost-benefit analysis perspective of undertaking policy innovation can be superseded by value-sensitive design in and of itself. And that's why I said that value-sensitive design may co-construct democracy, because many of the methodological underpinnings of value-sensitive design are democratic. And in such a way, it reinforces democratic values to allow us to achieve, I guess, optimal policy innovation. So I think that that's one way of inserting value-sensitive design into institutions in and of itself, is that we can actually design institutions in such a way, technical institutions, whatever they may be, in a way that is aligned with the values that underlie value-sensitive design. And so, and in doing so, the institution itself self-regulates in that way the design, the technical design that's undertaken inside of it.
Thanks, yeah. Daisy, do you have thoughts too on some next steps?
Well, I agree with Stephen that it would be very important to inform policymakers around the new technologies, the emerging technologies such as AIs and IoTs. In the tech policy that we actually bring in the human values into building those tech policies. And I know that both Batya and Jeroen, you are taking up this role in advising the policymakers in their making of construction of tech policies. Another thing that I also think is very important is the education, which we already discussed. And also with Dave Hendry, we had a separate panel that entirely focused on the aspect of value-sensitive design and education. Because yes, it is very important that we make sure that the next generation of engineers, designers, they actually have this in their mindset that they are working, what they are designing and building has huge implications for technology and the broader society, and that will make a huge impact as, in educating the new generations.
Well, great.
Dave, can I just comment on
Yes.
something that Stephen said I think is very important that we need to bring out very clearly, is that in Delft we've always conceived of the object of design as a socio-technical system. So it's a really big beast. It's not just the artifact or the device or the algorithm or the software, but it's the ensemble of human beings following rules in using that artifact, communicating about it with others, reaching out. So that is the object that you need to look at. And of course, then also that brings into scope governance, policy, rules, regulation, because human beings use this, they follow it, they have it on board, and they act on in compliance with it. So that is the systems environment that you're looking at. So you have to design that whole thing. And so, for example, if you now look at AI, everyone is talking about the algorithm or the data set. That you're zooming in on this particular part, but you forget that it's used by human beings in that context. So we know that. So that is very, very important. Yeah. And that brings in also in scope the design of policy and regulation as a component in that system.
Well, good. Maybe we can switch gears a little bit, and I'll put the question out for the panel. What are the two most important research topics for the next 5 to 10 years in value-sensitive design? And perhaps I'll begin with Batya for that, and we can go around.
Wow. Just speaking off the cuff, so to speak, right now, I think of two places where, if I ask myself the question, as we continue to build this body of knowledge, what are the maybe most important pieces of knowledge to build? One is, I think, following this conversation around practice or action that, as Daisy was articulating, and that really has to do with action in our technical processes. I think we need to find a way to be inside technical engineering organizations as they are making technical decisions, and begin to understand those processes and how value-sensitive design can become really integral to that in order to change those. I think one of the real challenges with that is actually the challenges around proprietary information. So organizations might welcome us in, but they might welcome us in with, say, non-disclosure agreements. And so we might be able to go in and help an organization, but then we can't bring out from that intervention what we've actually learned so that we can share that knowledge and build from that knowledge more generally. So I think there's a very interesting structural issue that needs to be addressed there so that we can really do this work effectively. So that's one place where I think, going back to Jeroen's point, we've built up a body of knowledge. We really are in a different place than we were 10 or 20 years ago. But to really have that uptake happen in a sustained way, in a knowledgeable way, we need to do that work. And then on the other hand, I think the other piece of work we really need to do is the multi-lifespan design work. I would love to see the community spawn a whole host of projects that are multi-lifespan projects. Those are long-term commitments. We're talking about multiple generations, so beginning things that we will then be passing to others, but taking up some of the issues around conflict, around systemic racism, around the environment. I think that to really make progress there, we need to take these longer term views. I've been spending a lot of time recently thinking about Daisy's dissertation around medical aid and dying, and the aspects that her work raised showing how much important work is going on in what are the apparent fallow periods. So for any of these longer term problems, I think we see catalytic moments, flashpoints, but there's a tremendous amount of work that happens between those that enables the next point going forward. And I think there's contributions that value-sensitive design can make to supporting those changes during both the fallow moments and then the catalytic moments. And so I think if we could, as a community, identify a series of problems and perhaps come together in small collectivities around those, with the idea of committing for the long term, that could be a really exciting kind of next way of framing our work in that dimension.
So I very much agree with this integration that needs to take place, and we have to make next steps. So we have to integrate this value-sensitive design and thinking about design and values in the methods and tools that engineers use. Right? So it needs to be the threshold needs to be very low for them to do it, and they have to see how to do it. And so we have to be even more helpful to them if we can. So, and I think in terms of what we found very helpful is think in terms of requirements. So requirements engineering. So every engineer needs to work with requirements. So these values imply requirements. And then suddenly, they find ethics very self-evident. So, oh, these are requirements that you're talking about. And so now I know what to do because, so that I will design something that meets those requirements. And then you can bring in all the other aspects of but what's the status of these requirements or these values? And have you thought about these aspects? And have you thought about these perspectives and these people? Because they will be affected later on, etc. But you start with what they know and what they need to do anyway to be a responsible engineer, and they have to design for a functionality. So that's we have to make next steps, and that's related to a research topic I think that we'll also be working on in Delft, is this operationalization of values. And so we are experimenting with some tools and see what students think and how they use it and whether they like it or not. So that's the other thing is the the systems perspective. So if you look at the world and the problems that we have, these are UN SDG problems. These are things to do with the water, food, energy nexus, with refugees, with drinking water, with conflicts all over the world. The things that you have also been working on in the lifespan, but. So we need to be able to transpose or apply this thinking to these huge kind of problems. Because the decisions that are made there, and as we speak, those decisions are made by diplomats, international lawyers, and politicians. They are huge consequences. You know, we're either ill-prepared or well-prepared for the next pandemic, or we make a mess of the next climate treaty or not. So there you also have to insert this thinking, this value-sensitive design thinking in the decisions that are made there, the policies that are prepared there. The UN has already started to think along those lines because they've established a new mechanism, a technology facilitation mechanism. So they are aware of the fact that technology is of huge importance, and now they need to make the next step and realize that they can also think about human rights and about the values that the UN has endorsed in thinking about the solutions to the UN SDG problems. So that is scaling up, right? So that's, on the one hand, we have to drill down to the details and look at the nitty-gritty stuff, what engineers, individual engineers in a particular project may need to do. And then on the other hand, we need to really scale up and put this in the arena of international politics and the UN.
Thank you, Jeroen. Daisy, Stephen?
Sure. I don't know if Daisy wants to go first or...
You can go first.
So I think building off the last two, I think one of the more difficult challenges for value-sensitive design, and we're beginning to see it now, is engineering in the non-civilian domain. So by that, I mean the military domain. As we know, the military, although has direct contact with the public in many ways through liaisons, PR, so on and so forth, the military in general is somewhat of a black box and separated, governed by its own rules, although by international law. And I think that obviously the design of both systems, infrastructures, institutions, as well as the technologies that are used in military applications provide a potentially difficult task for value-sensitive design, whether or not value-sensitive design has a place in military design. Obviously, military technologies have impacts on various publics and various stakeholders. The difficulty is, how do those stakeholders play a role in the design of these technologies? And I think that this is exacerbated furthermore by autonomous weapon systems. That has been a topic of debate for over the last decade at the international level, is on lethal autonomous weapons. And how we engage stakeholders, who exactly are the legitimate stakeholders, if we could even use the term to distinguish between adequate stakeholders and ones that are not sufficient for accounting in design. And then how do we hold design applications accountable for those types of decisions, given that we intuitively know military technology design is different in the way it's approached and applied than other technological systems. And of course, the military at large, regardless of which military we're talking about, but of course superpowers, have the social technical milieu of the military is extremely nebulous, and it's extremely difficult to navigate it, particularly at the national and international level. So I think that this poses a particular issue that may require modification to the design approach. But I think that there's still points of intervention between international law, human rights, and then designing for SDGs, for example, as a source of values, and particularly for autonomous weapon systems, other sources of values, for example, like the high-level expert group on AI.
Thank you, Stephen.
Yes, so for me, first, I wanted to kind of build on what Batya spoke about multi-lifespan design, because I've been personally working for a long time with Batya on multi-lifespan design projects. One of the things that I want to see in this multi-lifespan design, within this multi-lifespan design is to develop more historical views as we approach our technical systems design. So in the field of human-computer interaction, we are so used to talking about what is now, current, and then the future. The design itself is very much future-oriented. And as a field, we are not very used to talk about past and to reflect on our history, and then to build on from the long-term histories. And we are not very good at taking records and then keeping track of and then tracing those changes over time, especially over a very long period of time. But to engage in multi-lifespan design, this is very, very important. And more and more, we are talking about the ideas of value changes and value dynamics because we know that the world is changing, our value systems are changing, the kind of priorities of values that we held decades ago are now very different. So how do we engage with these changing values? We need to have historical perspective on design of technologies. I think this is very important, and this is very important to also bring into our education to have, because if I reflect on my own experience being trained as designers, I was always thinking about studying the world as is right now, and then to think about futures, but I was never trained to kind of take a historical view in my design process. So I think that one is important. And then another thing is relevant to what Stephen just spoke about stakeholders. So for me, I think one of the biggest contribution value-sensitive design has made to the field of human-computer interaction is the concept of stakeholders. So again, if I reflect back on when I was studying interaction design and when I was first exposed to HCI, human-computer interaction, we were always talking about users, and in most papers we were talking about user needs and user-centered design. What has changed now is that when I read papers and when I engage in discussions these days, people no longer talk about users, but we are actually conversing in terms of stakeholders. So I think that is a very, very huge contribution that VSD has made in the field. But still, there are practical questions remain because more and more we are engaging with problems that are at large scale. So the stakeholders that we need to engage with are becoming very complex. So the practical questions emerges: how do we actually engage with, who do we engage with, how do we engage with, who do we design for, who are left out, questions of inclusion and exclusion. So yeah, these practical questions I think is also something we need to address in the near term.
Well, thank you. That is an exciting roadmap that we have to look forward to. Ticking our way through those items will take many, many years. So thank you for that. Our time is coming to a pretty quick end here. One of the commitments that value-sensitive design makes is to progress, not perfection. So perhaps the panelists could give our audience a summative statement around progress and not perfection. And I will let you decide who would like to start.
Yeah, that's good that you bring it up. It's very important topic, and we've done some work on it, and it relates to another important research topic that we haven't spoken about at length, but that's value conflicts. So we have these. If there is a meta-ethics or one unifying ethical theory or view underlying value-sensitive design, I would say it's value pluralism. It's a value pluralism that comes with political liberalism that that includes kind of rich notions of democracy. So you have these multiple values, and these values we know are constantly in tension or in conflict and lead to dilemmas or difficult choices and disagreements. And one of the interesting structural features that we have discovered in these kind of design projects and people confronted with them in a technical setting is that they don't let's say they don't they're not satisfied with that conflict. They want to overcome and transcend that conflict. They want to actually satisfy all of their responsibilities, all of their obligations in a dilemmatic situation. We've called that moral overload, right? So you're morally overloaded. You want sustainability, and you want privacy, and you want safety and security and accountability. And oh yes, of course, democracy and human dignity. But so this commitment to these obligations that you have, which are implied by your values, lead to this stress, to this moral overload. And that is not paralyzing you if you at least have the right attitude to it, but it can prompt you to be more creative, to be really committed to it and say, well, perhaps I can think of something really clever here, and I can, oh yes, I can also accommodate sustainability. I already have privacy and I already have accountability, but if I do it this way, if I design it in this way, I can include more of my values. I can accommodate more of my values and respect more of my obligations that I have in this particular case. So progress, this is intimately related to the idea of progress, because what you're doing, you're moving from a situation where you could only satisfy one or two of your values to a situation that you have created by engineering and innovation, to a situation where you can satisfy n+1 of your values. So that is not perfection, but you have done slightly better because you had a brilliant idea. You said, and we have many, many of those examples. Also that the engineers and the technology people are very much committed to those values. They want to sneak in even more. Can we do this? Can we also do that? And so that is a kind of incremental, but still a very useful and interesting idea of progress, moral progress, where innovation becomes a moral notion. So that's my 5 cents on progress.
Sure. So I guess working within the Italian domain, which has, we can, to put it lightly, come late in the game in terms of addressing the literature on responsible innovation, that although initially meeting resistance, like I mentioned before, engineers in and of themselves have been quite open to considering from either a human-centric perspective or just ethics in general as a critical part in technology design, rather than as an opportunity cost to other types of economic values like profitability. And although at the beginning that's how many of the industry or business leaders that I've been in contact with, that we've been working with as part of engineering teams, understood these human-centered values, whatever they may be, these democratic values, as potentially coming at the opportunity cost of things like profitability. The benefit of value-sensitive design and responsible innovation literature in general in these various approaches is in reframing this type of moral overload, as you already mentioned, that profitability, which of course underlies much, if not all, of the industrial innovations that are currently being undertaken, does not come at that opportunity cost, and rather works in tandem and can actually be augmented with these values. But it's not, well, we frame it in such a way, obviously, that it's not for that reason. However, it does not come at that opportunity cost. We're seeing the progress, and by framing value-sensitive design as a particularly principled approach towards these ends, it's becoming more and more attracted and adopted. I've had some successes with some industry leaders here in Italy in adopting VSD as a practice within their engineering teams. So I consider that progress. That's my 2 cents.
That sounds like progress to me.
I was just going to say the same.
Daisy?
Yes. So design is never about perfection. As designers, we are always dealing with highly uncertain situations and unforeseen situations. But still, without answering our hand, still we have to act in the world, because design is acting. It is about acting in the world and learning by doing. But at the same time, we have to make sure that what we are doing, we're not doing things blindly. And in that sense, I want to, again, emphasize it is important to take a historical view to kind of look at the more broader historical context where you are working on very specific project and making specific action, and make sure that your that small actions and practical actions that you take is contributing toward small or greater progress in the longer terms of history. So that is my view on progress, not perfection. We're never perfect. We always have to act, and then we have to take a historical view and to make sure where we are positioned and that we are contributing to progress as opposed to setting back.
And Batya?
So I guess for myself, speaking both personally and I think from an engineering, technical, and policy institutional kind of way forward, and echoing a bit of, well, everyone, Daisy, I do think we act in very complex environments where there's a lot of uncertainty. And so in any given moment, perhaps we can see something that looks like a better course of action, or a step, a movement that we can take that we think is in a positive direction, without being able to understand all of the implications. And we can make that step. That's progress without perfection or without the comprehensive solution always in place. But then for me, another very important piece of this is that step itself changes the conditions. There are enormous ripple effects, some that we don't even know initially will happen. And by having made that first step, then actually the conditions change, and there may now be the possibility of a second step that didn't exist before. And so there is an unfolding that I think happens. And I think that this ability to act towards progress without perfection actually allows us to participate in that unfolding in a constructive manner. So I think it's working. For me, this is a process, an adage about process and about how one can move forward, and then the need to remain alert and the need to understand that it is a creating of conditions that unfold over time that ultimately we hope move us increasingly towards places that we believe will better support human flourishing. That is, I think, where where our compass is headed. Yeah, thank you for that question, Dave.
Well, and thank you to all of you. I want to thank the ETHICOMP committee for hosting this value-sensitive design track and all of their heroic efforts to make the conference work online. I think it's just fantastic. And I want to sincerely thank all the panelists for being here today and expressing such genuine and exciting ideas around value-sensitive design. I guess I'd like to make note of perhaps two main things. One thing is that we have the challenge of uptake before us. And this is going to be with us for a good number of years, I'm sure. And Jeroen offered a framework for thinking about uptake around institutional concerns, research concerns, and activism. And what I find so impressive about this panel is that we all had ideas and things for the future that connected to those three categories. And that was completely unplanned. So for that, I'm grateful. So with that, I think we'll close our panel, and I hope all of the audience enjoys this panel and other panels that are being hosted by ETHICOMP. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.